The apron had become my closest ally, long before it ever became my disguise. White linen starched at the chest, falling in a clean line to my knees. For 8 years, it had been the uniform of my devotion to the York household, and now, without my ever choosing it for this purpose, it had become the only thing standing between my secret and the rest of the world. I tightened the sash that morning, the way I tightened it every morning, smoothing the front twice with both palms, checking my reflection in the dark glass of the pantry window. My waist had not changed enough yet for anyone to notice, not really, not unless they were looking for it, but I was 4 months along, and I had started to feel the difference even if no one else could see it. The slight curve low beneath my navel, the new weight I carried when I climbed the back stairs, the way my body had begun quietly and without my permission to build a home for someone else. I worked the kitchen first because the kitchen was safe. Mrs. Enderser, Abel never looked up from her bread dough long enough to study the shape of me. And the underfootmen were too young and too distracted by their own gossip to notice anything beyond whether I'd remembered to refill the coffee urn. It was only when I carried the breakfast tray up to the east wing that the real performance began. Ken York had returned from the capital 3 weeks earlier, 6 months after his father's funeral, and the manor had not been the same since. Not worse. I want to be honest about that, even now, even knowing everything that came after, just different, sharper somehow. As though the air itself had been waiting for him to come back and reorganize it around his presence. I balanced the tray against my hip, the way I'd learned to do early in my pregnancy to keep the angle of my body from giving anything away, and knocked twice on the door of his study. "Come in, Carlos!" He always said my name like that. Not Lindsay, not Butler, not any of the formal titles his father had insisted upon. Just Carlos, soft at the edges, like he'd practiced saying it when no one else was listening. I pushed the door open with my shoulder and carried the tray to his desk, setting it down exactly where he liked it. Coffee to the right, correspondence stacked by urgency to the left. The morning paper folded so the financial section showed first. He was standing by the window jacket, already discarded, over the back of his chair. Sleeves rolled to the forearm in that careless way that made him look less like the master of an estate and more like the boy I remembered chasing through the orchard 20 years ago. "You look tired," he said, not turning around yet. My pulse did something complicated. "A poor night's sleep, young master, nothing more." "You've said that for 3 weeks running." I busied myself straightening papers that did not need straightening. Perhaps I am simply not a man who sleeps well in summer. He turned then, and I felt the full weight of his attention land on me the way it always did. Assessing, careful, far too perceptive for my comfort. Ken had his father's sharp green eyes, but none of his father's coldness. And it was that combination, intelligence wrapped in warmth, that had undone me long before I understood what was happening to my own heart. "You've lost weight in your face," he said, "but you walk like you're carrying something heavy." I kept my expression smooth through long practice. "An overactive imagination, sir, if I may say so." "You may always say so." A faint smile, there and gone. "Doesn't mean I'll believe you." I excused myself before the conversation could go any further because I had learned over the past month exactly how dangerous it was to stand too long in a room with Ken York while my body kept secrets that wanted, with every shallow breath, to spill themselves into the open air. It had not always been secrets between us. Once it had been nothing at all, just a butler and the boy who would inherit everything. 2 people who happened to grow up under the same roof on opposite sides of an invisible line neither of us had drawn ourselves. I had served his family since I was 19, trained by old Mr. Whitfield in the proper carriage of trays and the proper silence of servants, and somewhere in those years of careful service, I had fallen in love with a man I had no right to want. I did not plan for any of this to happen. I want that understood, even though I know there's no one to explain it to except myself, lying awake at night with my hand resting low on my own stomach, feeling for the small flutter that had only just begun. Ken and I had known each other since we were children in The Strange. lopsided way that happens in old houses where the master's son and the servant's children grow up breathing the same air without ever quite occupying the same world. My mother had worked the laundry rooms before illness took her, and I had grown up underfoot in this house, chasing dust motes through the long gallery, while Ken, 3 years older and twice as restless, escaped his tutors to find me. He used to say I was the only person in the manor who told him the truth about anything. Whether his Latin recitation was actually terrible, whether his new riding boots truly suited him, whether his father's temper that morning had been about the harvest or about something else entirely. I never thought of it as anything more than friendship, not then. Friendship was already a generous word for what an Omega laundry boy and the heir to an estate were technically permitted to share. When Mr. State Whitfield, the old head butler, took me on as his apprentice at 19, I told myself the closeness of my childhood would simply end there. Smoothed away by uniform and protocol, the way all such closeness eventually is in houses like this one. For a long while, it did. Ken went away to school then to the capital to learn his father's business, and I learned instead the precise geometry of trays and the correct temperature of wine and the particular silence expected of a good butler. A silence I wore so well that even I most days forgot there was a person underneath it who had once climbed apple trees with the boy he now served. It was only when Ken came home for his father's final illness, 2 years ago now, that the silence began to crack. He sought me out in the evenings, the way he used to as a child, finding excuses to linger near the pantry, asking after my opinion on matters far beneath a butler's concern, looking at me sometimes with an expression I refused for a long time to let myself name. I told myself it was grief, making him sentimental, nostalgia for a simpler version of his own childhood. I told myself a great many comfortable lies in those 2 years, and every one of them dissolved completely on the night his father finally died. The night it happened 6 months ago. Now the manor had been draped in black crepe for the old master's funeral, and Ken had come home from burying his father with a look on his face I'd never seen on him before, not grief exactly, or not only grief but something rawer, something that looked like a man discovering for the first time that the ground beneath him was not as solid as he'd believed. I'd brought him brandy he didn't drink. I'd sat with him in the dark of the study because he asked me to stay just this once, just for tonight, and an Omega does not easily refuse an Alpha's quiet need, especially not when that Alpha is grieving and that Omega has loved him in silence for the better part of a decade. I won't describe what happened after that. Some things belong only to the two of us, sealed in memory the way a pressed flower is sealed in glass, beautiful, private, untouched by the ordinary air. I will only say that when morning came, Ken left for the capital on business that could not wait, called away before either of us had spoken a single word about what we'd done. And by the time he returned 4 months later, I already knew. I had not told him. I told myself 100 different reasons why, and every one of them was true, and none of them made the lie easier to carry. He was the young master, and I was his butler. He would inherit a name and a fortune and a seat on the regional council, and I would inherit nothing but the shame of having let an Alpha's grief and an Omega's love tangle themselves into something that could ruin us both. If his family discovered I carried his child, I would be dismissed before the sun set, not because Ken would want it. I believed that much about him even then, but because his grandmother controlled the purse strings of this estate, and the old woman had never once looked at me as anything more than furniture that happened to walk and speak. So I hid it under loose trousers and longer waistcoats, under the apron I wore from dawn until dusk, which had always been wide enough to disguise a multitude of sins and now disguised the greatest one of all. The 4 months of Ken's absence had been, in their own quiet way, the loneliest of my life. I discovered the truth of my condition alone in the small hours of a March morning, kneeling on the bathroom tiles with my hand pressed to a stomach that had begun rejecting breakfast for reasons I'd at first blamed on bad fish. The physician who confirmed it for me was a careful, kind older man named Dr. Prusses, Hale, who had delivered half the village and asked no questions he didn't strictly need answered, though I caught the calculation in his eyes when he asked, gently, whether the child's father knew. He's away on business, I told him, which was true, and let him assume whatever comfortable conclusion he wished from it. I wrote Ken 3 letters in those 4 months that I never sent. I have them still folded into the lining of an old coat at the back of my wardrobe, pages of careful handwriting circling around the truth without ever quite landing on it. Each one abandoned halfway through and begun again the next week with slightly different words and exactly the same fear. In the end, I burned none of them and sent none of them, and when his carriage finally rolled up the drive in early summer, I greeted him at the door in a freshly let-out waistcoat with my apron tied a careful half-inch tighter than usual and said nothing at all. It worked for a while. It worked right up until the morning Ken York noticed first. The thing about hiding a pregnancy from an alpha, even an inexperienced one, even one who has never had cause to learn the particular language of an omega's changing body, is that scent does not lie the way clothing can. I noticed Ken noticing nearly 2 weeks before the day everything finally broke open. It started small. He would pause mid-sentence when I entered a room, his nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly, his gaze sharpening before he caught himself and smoothed his expression back into politeness. Once, while I poured his evening wine, he leaned slightly toward me without seeming to realize he'd done it, then straightened just as quickly, frowning at his own hand as though it had betrayed him. "Is something wrong, sir?" "No, nothing." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You smell different lately, that's all." My heart slammed against my ribs hard enough that I feared he might hear it too. Different how, if I may ask? I don't know. He looked genuinely puzzled, almost troubled by his own confusion. Sweeter, warmer, like... He stopped himself, shaking his head, laughing a little at his own foolishness. Forget it, I'm imagining things. I excused myself and did not breathe properly again until I reached the safety of the linen closet, where I pressed both hands flat against my stomach and whispered to the small life inside me to please stay quiet just a little longer. It was not only my scent that betrayed me, though that alone might eventually have been enough. There was the morning he found me retching quietly behind the rose hedge, having barely made it outside before my stomach rebelled against the smell of frying bacon drifting from the kitchen window. "Carlos?" His voice carried real alarm. He crossed the lawn in long strides and was crouched beside me before I could compose myself, one hand hovering at my back, not quite touching, as though he wasn't sure he was allowed. "What's wrong? Should I send for the physician?" "It's nothing, sir. A weak stomach this morning, that's all." I wiped my mouth with the back of my wrist and forced myself upright too quickly, swaying slightly, and his hand caught my elbow before I even registered I needed catching. "You've been unwell for weeks." His green eyes searched my face with an intensity that made me want to look away, and made me, perversely, want to never look away again. "I'm not a fool, Carlos, whatever you might think. Something is happening to you, and you keep telling me it's nothing. With respect, young master, some matters are simply private." Something flickered across his face, hurt maybe, or frustration, or both tangled together. "Private from me?" I had no answer for that which would not unravel everything, so I said nothing at all. And after a long moment, he released my arm and stepped back, his jaw tight, and let me walk away from him without another word. I told myself it was a mercy. I told myself a great many things that spring, most of them lies dressed up as kindness. It was around the same time that Lady Constance began inviting guests to dinner with a frequency that even I, a man trained never to question the comings and goings of the family, found impossible not to notice. There was a young alpha lord named Edric Holloway who came to dine 3 times in as many weeks, always seated beside Ken at his grandmother's insistence, always discussed afterward in tones that made his intentions and Lady Constance's hopes perfectly clear to anyone with ears. I served their dinners with a steadiness I was almost proud of, given the circumstances. I poured Lord Holloway's wine and refilled his water and stood at perfect attention while he laughed at his own jokes, a half-second too long, and watched Ken across the table with the particular hunger of a man calculating an advantageous match. I told myself it meant nothing to me. I told myself this with such conviction, in fact, that I nearly believed it right up until the evening. I caught Ken's eyes finding mine across the dining room in the middle of one of Lord Holloway's stories. An apology written so plainly into his expression that I had to excuse myself to the kitchen before my own face betrayed something far more dangerous than weariness. "He doesn't want him, Mrs. Barrios," Abel said quietly, finding me gripping the edge of the sink with both hands. "Anyone with eyes can see where the young master keeps looking, Carlos, and it isn't toward the head of that table. It doesn't matter where he looks, if his grandmother has already decided where his future goes." "His grandmother," she said, with the particular dryness of a woman who had served this family for 30 years, "has decided a great many things over the years that didn't come to pass. I wouldn't spend too much worry on Lord Holloway, if I were you." I wanted desperately to believe her. I carried that small, fragile hope through 3 more dinners and a great deal of pointed sighing from Lady Constance until Lord Holloway finally stopped receiving invitations altogether. Not, I would learn much later, because Ken had ever shown him the slightest encouragement, but because Ken had told his grandmother plainly after the 3rd dinner that he had no intention of marrying a man he felt nothing for simply to satisfy a ledger of advantageous connections, whatever the cost to her plans. I did not know any of this at the time. I only knew that the invitations stopped, and that some small, foolish part of my heart allowed itself, against every sensible instinct, to hope. The household, I should say, was not entirely ignorant of my condition. Mrs. Probabuzerade. Abel had guessed within the first month. Older Omegas, she told me once, with a gentleness I hadn't expected, always recognize their own kind's changing scent, even when the rest of the world remains blind to it. She never asked who the father was. She only began quietly adjusting my workload, taking the heaviest trays for herself, scolding the underfootman for letting me climb stairs unassisted, all without ever once saying the word aloud between us. "You'll have to tell him eventually," she said one evening, kneading dough with more force than the bread strictly required. "A baby doesn't stay a secret forever, Carlos. Bodies aren't built for secrets, not past a certain point." "I know. Do you love him?" The question landed so plainly, so without preamble, that I nearly dropped the tray I was carrying. "Mrs. Abel?" "It's a simple question. Do you love the young master?" I set the tray down very carefully, giving myself a reason not to meet her eyes. "It doesn't matter whether I do. He is the young master of this estate, and I am his butler, and there is exactly one acceptable distance between those 2 facts, and I have already crossed it in a way that cannot be uncrossed. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." She studied me with an expression I couldn't quite read, pity maybe, or something gentler than pity, and went back to her dough without pressing further. Though I caught her watching me for the rest of the evening with a thoughtful furrow between her brows that told me the conversation was far from finished in her own mind, even if she'd let it rest in mine. The cravings, when they came, were almost comical in their inconvenience. I developed, in my 5th month, an inexplicable and overwhelming need for pickled lemons of a sort the kitchen had never once stocked in 8 years of my service, and Mrs. Averwan, Abel took to sending the youngest footman into the village twice a week on increasingly elaborate errands she refused to explain to anyone who asked. The moods were harder to laugh away. I wept once, alone in the linen closet, over nothing more dramatic than a torn pillowcase, and sat afterward on an overturned laundry basket, feeling utterly ridiculous and utterly unable to stop. Ken found me there, eventually, drawn by some instinct I didn't fully understand at the time, and would later recognize as an alpha's response to distress he couldn't yet name. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply sat down on the floor beside the basket, his good trousers be damned, and stayed there in silence until my breathing evened out. "You don't have to tell me," he said quietly when I'd finally stopped shaking. "Whatever it is. I just didn't want you sitting in here alone. You're very patient with me lately. I've always been patient with you. You've simply never let me practice it on anything this large before. A small, careful smile. Whatever's wrong, Carlos, I wish you'd let me help carry some of it. I nearly told him everything in that moment. The words rose in my throat, fully formed, ready to spill out into the quiet of the linen closet. And then I imagined his face changing. Imagined, Lady Constance's voice. Imagined the careful architecture of my employment and my secret heart collapsing all at once. And I swallowed the truth back down where it had lived for months and told him instead that I was simply tired. And let him believe it because it was easier than watching him recalculate everything he thought he knew about me. He left eventually with obvious reluctance, pausing at the door to look back at me with an expression that has stayed with me ever since. Not suspicion exactly, but something close to it, something that told me even then that the careful architecture I'd built was already beginning quietly to crack. The day everything changed began like any other, which is, I suppose, how most days that change everything tend to begin. No thunderclap, no warning. Only an ordinary Thursday morning with an ordinary breakfast tray and an ordinary stack of correspondence that I carried up to the study with my apron tied a fraction too tight because I had begun in the last week. To feel the bump beneath it grow stubbornly impossible to disguise. I was halfway across the room when my vision swam. It happened without warning. The lightheadedness that had plagued me on and off for weeks, usually manageable, usually something I could breathe through if I paused long enough. But the tray was heavy, and my balance had been poor all morning, and I had eaten almost nothing the night before, too anxious to keep food down. And the floor tilted beneath me with a suddenness that left no time for careful management of anything at all. The tray hit the carpet with a crash of porcelain. I heard myself make a small, strangled sound, and then Ken's hands were on me, catching me before I followed the tray to the floor, his arm hooking around my back and pulling me hard against his chest. Carlos. The fear in his voice cut through even my dizziness. Carlos, look at me, stay with me. I clutched at his shirt, my vision clearing slowly, my breath coming in unsteady gulps, and it was only as the room steadied around me that I realized with a horror that turned my blood to ice, that in the chaos of falling and catching my apron had ridden up and twisted, and the loose waistcoat beneath it had come untucked from my trousers, and there plainly visible in the morning light streaming through the study windows was the unmistakable curve of my stomach. Ken's eyes followed mine downward. I will remember the silence that followed for the rest of my life. It stretched out between us, vast and terrible, while his hand, still braced against my back, still holding me upright, went very still. Carlos. His voice had changed entirely. Quiet. Careful, in the way a man is careful when he's afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter something fragile. Please. The word tore out of me before I could stop it, raw and pleading. Please let me explain before you say anything else. He didn't let go of me. That was the first thing I noticed, even through my panic. That even now, even with the truth laid bare between us in the worst possible way, his arms did not loosen. If anything, they tightened, as though some instinct in him had already decided, before his mind had caught up, that he was not about to let me fall a second time. How far along? His voice had dropped lower still, rough at the edges. 4 months. I could not look at his face. I stared instead at the second button of his shirt, fixed on it like an anchor. Almost 5. I felt him go rigid against me as the arithmetic resolved itself in his mind, as the date attached itself unmistakably to the night neither of us had ever spoken of since. When he finally spoke again, his voice cracked clean down the middle. Mine. Not a question. A man arriving, brick by brick, at a conclusion he'd been circling for weeks without letting himself land on it. It's mine. I closed my eyes. Yes. He helped me to the chaise by the window with a gentleness that nearly undid me more than anger would have. I sat with my hands folded over the curve. I could no longer hide watching him pace the length of the study with his hands raked through his hair, and I waited heart-pounding. For the dismissal I had spent 5 months bracing myself to receive. Why didn't you tell me? He stopped pacing abruptly, turning to face me, and the look on his face wasn't fury. It was something far harder to bear, something wounded, something almost betrayed. I came home 4 months ago, Carlos. 4 months. You let me walk past you every single day without saying a word. What would you have had me say? My voice shook despite everything I did to steady it. That the night your father died, I let grief and instinct and feelings I had no business having carry us both somewhere we shouldn't have gone, and now I'm carrying the consequence of it? You are the master of this estate. I am the man who polishes your silver and pours your wine. There is no version of that conversation that ends well for someone in my position. You thought I would throw you out. I thought your grandmother would throw me out, and that you, being the decent man you are, would feel obligated to fight her on my behalf and lose because she controls every penny of this estate until your 30th birthday. And I refused to be the reason you spent the next year at war with your own family over a butler's mistake. A mistake. His voice cracked on the word disbelieving. Is that what this is to you? That's not. I pressed a hand to my eyes. Exhausted in every way a person can be exhausted. I didn't mean it that way. I meant the position I've put us both in. Not the child. Never the child. He crossed the room and knelt in front of me then, taking both my hands in his, and the desperate sincerity in his face stole whatever protest I'd been gathering right out of my chest. Carlos. Look at me. I made myself meet his eyes. I have spent 6 months trying to understand why the manor felt different the moment I came home to it, why I couldn't stop watching you across every room you walked into, why some part of me kept asking questions my own mind refused to answer honestly. I told myself it was grief. I told myself it was exhaustion, or stress, or simply missing my father more than I knew how to say out loud. But it was never any of that, was it? I didn't trust my voice enough to answer. I have loved you, he said very quietly, since long before that night. And I think some coward's part of me has known it since I was 17 years old, and you caught me sneaking out to the orchard and didn't tell my father. Just sat with me under the apple trees instead, and let me talk until the sun came up. I have loved you for years, Carlos, and I let you carry this alone for 5 months because I was too blind or too afraid to ask the right questions sooner. That is the only mistake in this room. Not you. Not this child. Me. I wept then finally, after months of forcing every feeling underground, and Ken gathered me against his chest on the floor of his study and held me while I shook apart his hand, moving in slow circles against my back, murmuring my name like an apology and a vow at once. The relief, of course, did not last beyond that single afternoon. Some truths, once spoken aloud, set entire households in motion, and the York estate was no exception. Lady Constance York, Ken's grandmother, a woman whose spine had never once bent to accommodate another person's comfort, summoned us both to the drawing room before nightfall, having heard, through whatever invisible network carries gossip through the walls of old houses, that her grandson's butler was carrying his child. You will dismiss him, she said to Ken without preamble, not even glancing in my direction, as though I were a piece of damaged furniture being discussed for disposal. Quietly. Generously, if you insist, though I see no reason to reward this kind of recklessness with anything beyond a month's wages and a closed carriage to the train station. No. The single word landed in the room like a struck bell. Lady Constance's eyes narrowed. I beg your pardon? I said no, grandmother. Ken stood beside my chair, not in front of me, not behind me, beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder with a steadiness I drew strength from without meaning to. Carlos is not being dismissed. He is carrying my child, and I intend to claim that child and him openly and without apology. You intend to disgrace this family. I intend to tell the truth, which I understand can look similar from where you're sitting, but the two are not the same thing. His voice stayed level, though I could feel the tension radiating off him through the hand on my shoulder. Father built this estate's name on the idea that the York family does the right thing even when it costs something. I am his son. I mean to honor that, not the version of our name that hides its mistakes behind closed carriages. He is staff, Kenneth. He is the man I love, and the parent of my child, and if this family cannot make room for both truths at once, then I will happily take my inheritance early and build a smaller house somewhere that can." The silence that followed was different from the one in the study earlier. Colder, sharper, weighted with decades of expectation, grinding slowly to a halt. Lady Constance looked at her grandson for a long moment, then, finally, at me, really looked at me, for what felt like the first time in 8 years of service. "You," she said. "Lindsay, do you love my grandson, or have you simply found a comfortable way to secure your future?" The insult should have stung more than it did, but I found I no longer had the energy to fear her the way I once had. "I have loved him since before I understood what love was supposed to feel like, my lady. I never once planned for any of this, and if it would spare him the cost of his family's disappointment, I would have hidden this child until the day I died rather than ask him to choose between us. He chose anyway. I did not ask it of him." Something shifted, almost imperceptibly, behind the old woman's eyes. She did not soften. I don't believe Lady Constance York was built with the particular hinges that allow for softening, but something in her recalculated, the way a strategist recalculates when a battlefield no longer matches the map they were given. "Well," she said at last, rising from her chair with the air of a woman ending a conversation entirely on her own terms, regardless of how it had actually unfolded. "I suppose the staff will need to be informed. There's to be a wedding, then, before the child arrives and the timeline becomes an embarrassment we can't outrun. I trust you'll manage the arrangements yourself, Kenneth, since you seem so determined to manage everything else." She left the room without waiting for a response, and it was only once her footsteps faded down the hallway that I realized I was still holding my breath and that Ken, beside me, had finally exhaled. "Did she just, I believe," Ken said slowly, sitting down hard on the arm of my chair as though his legs had given out. "My grandmother just gave us her blessing in the single most Lady Constance way imaginable." I laughed, a startled, disbelieving sound, and he laughed with me, and for a moment the whole impossible weight of the day lifted just enough that I could breathe properly again. The relief did not survive the week. Lady Constance's grudging blessing was one obstacle cleared. But the York estate, I would learn, had more than one gatekeeper, and the next of them arrived 3 days later in the form of Ken's uncle, Edmund York, the family's solicitor and trustee of the late master's will, summoned by some channel of his mother's. I never fully understood. He met us in the same drawing room, a thin, precise man with his brother's jaw and none of his brother's warmth. A leather folio of documents already open across his knee before either of us had taken a seat. "I understand congratulations are in order," he said, in a tone that suggested he understood nothing of the kind. "Though I confess I have questions about the legal architecture of this announcement that I doubt either of you have considered." "State them," Ken said, his hand finding mine on the settee without seeming to think about it. "The estate's succession is bound to legitimate heirs born of a recognized union. A child born before that union is formalized, exists legally speaking, in a rather uncomfortable shadow, and a butler, elevated to the position of spouse without proper documentation of intent, predating the child's conception, invites exactly the kind of scrutiny this family cannot afford during a transition of inheritance." "Then we'll marry before the child is born," Ken said simply, as though this were the most obvious solution in the world, which I suppose, to him, it was. "I've already told grandmother as much." "Marrying in haste raises its own questions, Kenneth. People will say whatever they like regardless of what we do, Uncle. I'd rather they say it about a man who married for love than a man who hid a child out of shame. Draft whatever papers protect the estate's interests. I'll sign anything that doesn't ask me to deny my own son." Edmund York studied his nephew for a long moment, the precise calculation behind his eyes not unlike his mother's, and then, unexpectedly, something in his expression eased. "Your father," he said slowly, "would have argued with me for an hour about the optics before arriving, eventually at exactly this same conclusion. I see the resemblance is not only in the jaw." He closed his folio with a small, decisive snap. I'll have the documents ready within the week. See that the wedding happens before the child does, and I'll manage the rest. He left without further ceremony, and Ken exhaled a long breath beside me, some tension I hadn't realized he was carrying, finally loosening from his shoulders. That went better than I feared, he admitted. You were magnificent, I told him, and meant it entirely. There remained, of course, the household itself. The staff I had served alongside for years, who deserved to hear the truth from me directly rather than gathered secondhand through the kitchen grapevine. We told them together 2 evenings later, gathered in the servants' hall after the day's work was done. Ken standing beside me with his hand at the small of my back, the way he'd taken to doing whenever he sensed my nerve wavering. I had braced myself for shock, perhaps even for quiet disapproval from those who'd known me only as the careful, correct butler I'd spent 8 years becoming. What I received instead was Mrs. Dad, Abel's loud, unrepentant declaration that she'd known for months and was only surprised it had taken the rest of them so long to catch up, and the youngest footman's immediate, earnest question about whether this meant he could finally stop pretending he hadn't noticed me being sick behind the rose hedge every morning for a month. You all knew, I said, half laughing, half undone. Carlos, Mrs. Abel said, not unkindly. We have eyes. We simply also have manners, which is more than I can say for some people's grandmothers. The laughter that went through the room after that loosened something in my chest that had been clenched tight since the morning the tray had fallen, and for the first time since this whole impossible secret had begun, I felt the full weight of it lift entirely from my shoulders, shared now among people who had, it seemed, been carrying small private pieces of it for me far longer than I'd ever realized. The wedding took place in early autumn, in the small chapel at the edge of the estate grounds, with the apple trees Ken had once snuck out to as a boy standing heavy with fruit just beyond the windows. I wore no apron that day. It was strange, almost dizzying, to stand in front of the household I had served for 8 years wearing a coat cut for a bridegroom rather than a uniform cut for a servant. My stomach now rounded enough that there was no disguising it, and for the first time in months, no need to. Mrs. Abel cried through the entire ceremony, loudly enough that Ken leaned over halfway through his vows to whisper that he hoped she'd save some tears for the actual birth. The under-footman, who had apparently known far more than I'd ever credited them for, had decorated the chapel steps with late roses cut from the very hedge I'd once been sick behind, which struck me as either very sweet or very cruel, depending on which of them I asked. Lady Constance sat in the front pew with her spine perfectly straight and her expression perfectly unreadable, and when the ceremony ended and Ken kissed me in front of everyone, slow, certain, unhurried, as though we had all the time in the world now and meant to use every second of it, I caught her dabbing very discreetly at the corner of one eye with a handkerchief, an action she would have denied to her grave had anyone been foolish enough to mention it. The months that followed the wedding were, in their own quiet way, stranger than anything that had come before them, not because anything dramatic happened, but precisely because nothing did. There was no more hiding, no more careful arrangement of aprons and waistcoats, no more lies dressed up as kindness. I simply lived, openly, as Ken's husband and the future parent of his child, and the ordinariness of it took some weeks to feel like anything other than a held breath waiting to be punished. Dr. Ty Hale came twice a month now, openly welcomed through the front door rather than smuggled in through the servants' entrance as he had been in the earlier months. And Ken insisted on sitting in for every visit, despite the doctor's gentle suggestion more than once that fathers were not strictly required to witness quite so much detail about their husband's changing body. I'd like to know everything, Ken told him, the first time the old physician raised an eyebrow at his presence. I missed the first 4 months without knowing it. I don't intend to miss anything else. He took to resting his hand against the curve of my stomach in the evenings after the household had gone quiet, talking to our son in a low, private voice about whatever had occupied his day, a difficult letter from a tenant, a particularly stubborn negotiation over grain prices once memorably, an entire half-hour spent explaining the rules of cricket to a child who could not yet hear him simply because he'd run out of other topics and refused to stop talking altogether. "You know he can't understand a word of that," I told him, laughing, my fingers in his hair as he lay with his ear pressed to my stomach. "He'll understand the sound of my voice," Ken said, not lifting his head. "That has to count for something." We turned the old nursery, Ken's own nursery, decades unused, full of dust sheets and the particular hush of rooms long closed, into something new together, an activity that occupied most of our quiet evenings that autumn. Ken insisted on repainting the walls himself rather than hiring it done, and made a considerable mess of it, and refused with stubborn pride to let me near a paint can in my condition, no matter how many times I pointed out that I was perfectly capable of holding a brush steady. "Sit," he told me, for perhaps the 10th time, steering me firmly toward the old rocking chair he'd had brought up from the attic and restored. "Direct from there. I'm an excellent listener. You painted that entire wall the wrong shade of blue. It's a very handsome shade of blue. It's the color of a bruise, Ken." He turned to look at me. Paint streaked across one cheekbone, an expression of such wounded dignity on his face that I laughed until my sides ached. And he set down his brush and crossed the room and kissed the laughter right out of my mouth, his hands careful and warm against the curve of me. And I thought not for the first time that autumn that I had spent 8 years serving this man's comfort, and somehow impossibly ended up cherished by him instead. Our son was born in the dead of winter, in the same bedroom Ken had been born in, with snow falling thick and silent past the windows and Mrs. Bust, Abel boiling water in the kitchen below with the same ferocious devotion she once gave her bread dough. They placed him in my arms, still warm from the world he'd just left, and I looked down at his small, furious red face and felt something inside my chest crack open entirely, rearranging itself around a love I hadn't known I had room for until that exact moment. Ken sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression of such naked wonder that I nearly forgot for a moment that this man had once been simply the young master of an estate I served, and I had once been simply his butler, and the distance between those two facts had once seemed to me entirely impossible to cross. "What do we call him?" Ken asked, his finger brushing impossibly gently against one tiny curled fist. I thought of the apron folded away now in the back of a wardrobe I no longer needed it for, of 5 months of careful lies and quiet fear, of a single night of grief turned tenderness that had somehow grown into all of this, a husband, a child, a future neither of us had dared to imagine when we were simply two people standing on opposite sides of a line that had never, in the end, been as solid as either of us believed. "Something that means he never has to hide anything," I said, "not for a single day of his life." Ken looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw the same boy who'd once trusted a butler's silence under the apple trees, grown now into a man who had chosen in front of his entire family and household to trust that same person with everything else as well. "Then we'll find the right name together," he said, leaning down to press his forehead gently against mine, our son sleeping warm and safe between us, the way we should have done everything from the very beginning. Outside, the snow kept falling soft and endless against the dark windows, and inside for the first time since that storm-soaked night 6 months before any of this had a name. I felt no need to hide a single thing about myself at all. We named him Theodore in the end, after no one in particular. Ken liked the sound of it, and I liked that it belonged to no family ledger, no expectation. Nothing he would ever have to live up to or apologize for. Lady Constance pronounced it acceptable, which from her was nearly an embrace, and within a year had taken to visiting the nursery so often that Mrs. Dat. Abel began joking, never quite within the old woman's hearing, that the estate's most formidable matriarch had been thoroughly conquered by a creature who couldn't yet hold up his own head. I still wear an apron most mornings, though these days it serves no purpose beyond keeping flour off my shirt when I help Mrs. the Farmy. Abel with the bread, a habit I never quite gave up even after I stopped needing to disguise anything beneath it. Ken finds this endlessly amusing, though he's never said so outright. I catch him sometimes watching me from the kitchen doorway with that same soft, assessing look he used to give me across his study desk. Except now, there's nothing careful or hidden in it at all. Only the plain, unguarded fondness of a man who no longer has any reason to look away. Some mornings carrying Theodore on my hip through the long gallery where I once chased dust motes as a child, I think about the apron I tied a half-inch too tight for 5 frightened months. About every lie I told myself in the name of protecting a love I was certain could never survive the daylight. I think about how wrong I was, and how grateful I am to have been wrong, and how strange it is that the thing I feared most, being truly seen, turned out in the end to be the only thing that ever could have saved me. Ken still says my name the same way he always has. Soft at the edges, like he's practiced it, like it's the truest word he knows. I no longer have to wonder what it means when he says it. I simply get to hear it every single day for exactly as long as we both have left to share it. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.